Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Victoria Lynn, and I'm Director of TarraWarra Museum of Art. Today's presentation will be a live translation of English to Indonesian and Indonesian to English. This translation can be accessed by a button on the bottom of your screen called Interpretation. And there you can choose the channel that you want to follow. On the eve of National Reconciliation Week here in Australia, 2022, I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose land I live and work, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. The theme of this year's Reconciliation Week is Be Brave, Make Change. We hope that this webinar and the two that follow represent steps towards being brave, making change, and tackling the unfinished business of reconciliation. Welcome to the Soils Project Groundwork, a webinar series which will be held over each Wednesday of the next 3 Wednesdays, including today. A timely conversation about the climate crisis, sustainability, and land sovereignty. This project is presented by TarraWarra Museum of Art, Struggles for Sovereignty in Indonesia, and the Abbemuseum in the Netherlands. The Soils Project has been in development since 2018. It explores and embraces the complex and diverse relationships between environmental change and colonisation within the Netherlands, Indonesia, and Australia. The deep histories of each location, the multiplicity of landscapes and environments, and the diverse impacts of farming, mining, plantations, colonisations, and global industries on cultural heritage, land management, and traditional knowledges. The project seeks to promote decolonial solidarity from a landscape of multiplicity. We recognise that knowledge is situated and specific to locations. And we recognise that some sacred and significant knowledges cannot be shared. As you've seen, the series has been supported by the Australia Council for the Arts, the Federal Government's Arts Funding and Advisory Body, the Sydney Myer Fund, and Monash University's Art, Design and Architecture. The program for today is a welcome to country by Wurundjeri educator, language worker and artist Brooke Wandoon, a short film about Coranderrk Aboriginal Station featuring Wurundjeri elder Uncle Dave Wandoon, a conversation between Brooke and Uncle Dave, a response by Yuni Sandarai, an adat activist and member of Perempuan Aman in Indonesia. And then the second half is moderated and facilitated by Alban Manizi, a landscape urbanist based in Malaysia. This conversation will also include the previous mentioned speakers, along with Yorta Yorta Man and head of the Willan Centre for Indigenous Arts and Cultural Development at the University of Melbourne, Tiriki Onus. And then we'll open up for questions. If you have questions, you can either wait until then and raise your hand symbol, or you could enter a question as we go into the chat, and Charlotte Carter will ask the questions for you towards the end. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Uncle Dave Wandoon, Wurundjeri Elder and Director of Wandoon Estate Aboriginal Corporation, which was established to manage Coranderrk Aboriginal Station when 200 acres of original station were returned to the Wurundjeri ownership in 1998. Uncle Dave is also the Manager of Cultural Practices, Fire and Water at the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung Cultural Heritage Aboriginal Corporation, and is a recognised leader in both the promotion and execution of cultural burns in Victoria. Brooke Wandoon is a Wurundjeri educator, language worker and artist. Brooke has developed and facilitated a range of cultural education programs, providing Wurundjeri cultural and historical education for preschool to tertiary students. She is also one of the directors of the Wandoon Estate Aboriginal Corporation and is the current Indigenous Victorian Aboriginal Cultural Research Fellow at the State Library of Victoria, where she's examining materials relating to Woiwurrung language to assist in the development of a Woiwurrung language database. I'll now hand over to Brooke Wandoon to do the Welcome to Country.
Mamanik Yurongi Tumbanyat, Wawa Naranik Brooke Wandoon, Kulin ba Maimit Polok Burung yalingbu, Bikal Binapal Wurundjeri Wurundjeri Bagaruk, Tulap Burungik Woiwurrung Dumba, Babanik Bedelia ba Mamanik Allen, Gugunik Olive ba Nyagapik James. Liwiki Wandoon ba Porate ba Bebian ba Bala. Kulinik Bambut Wintut. Kulinin Big Wadamba ba Nyara Jaranon. Big Palat Nyanyim Bulapin. Bunjil Gamajib Gulen Birrarung. Wan Birrarung. Wan Big Corno. Woiwurrung Big Yaluk ba Nyurak ba Banhol. Big Kedu. My father permits me to speak with you all. Hello, my name is Brooke Wandoon. Many different languages and people here today. I belong to Wurundjeri country, Managum country. I am a proud speaker of Woiwurrung. I then explained my family, parents, grandparents, ancestors, my connection to country. My people have been here since people were born. My people heal and renew country. Country keeps us all strong. Bunjil created man from the Birrarung. I come from the Birrarung. I come from the clay. Walk gently on country. Wawa from my home here in Hillsville, the Yarra Valley in Victoria, Australia. We're about 1 hour's drive east of Melbourne, where I am surrounded by mountains. The temperatures are getting cooler, and in the evenings, a thick fog settles into the valley. I belong to this country through my father. When I speak about country, I speak about my family, and I speak about myself. Before colonisation, welcome to country was known as Dandarum. Dandarum allowed people from other neighbouring mobs to have access to country for a certain time and for a clearly defined purpose. It was expected that while on country, you will show respect for all. No damage or harm would come to the earth, the plants, the animals, the people, and most importantly, the laws and the language of that land would be obeyed. So today, usually the focus is on the person or the language group doing the welcoming, but the onus was and still should be on the visitor. It was up to them and you to take on the laws and the customs of that place, regardless of the laws and customs that you are most familiar with. After Bunjil had created the landscape, the rocks, the rivers, the mountains, the plants, the animals, he was not satisfied. Creating man was a greater challenge and a test of his skills. He prepared 2 sheets of bark, cutting them into the shape that he thought a noble creature would have. Next, he took clay from the Birrarung, the Yarra River, and moulded it to the shape of the bark. He then danced around the 2 inert figures, planting in them the seeds of knowledge and the capacity to reason and learn. Again, Bunjil danced around them and breathed life into their mouths, nostrils, and navels. Slowly the men rose to their feet and joined Bunjil, dancing and singing the first words ever spoken by man. After Bunjil had completed his work, he asked Ballan to open his bag of winds and to blow him high into the sky, where he now looks down upon his creation as a star. It's no surprise that we, the Wurundjeri people, respect the land and the waterways, as we believe the human form was created from the earth. Birrarung rises up from country at Bawbaw, and she is a beast. She's over 242 kilometres in length. She supports life throughout Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country. She flows past alpine marshes, granite outcrops, towering mountain ash trees, a plethora of ferns. She tumbles down waterfalls and she smashes into rocks. She winds past ancient myrtle beech trees and wattles, and when in flood, she spills over her banks, drenching the land. She sustains us all. The spiritually significant Birrarung, the Yarra River, was once a cascading series of waterfalls from the Melbourne Cricket Ground down to where the Melbourne Aquarium is located today in the Melbourne CBD. I think it's almost a kilometre in length. During the 1880s, the ever-flowing waterway was blasted with dynamite and straightened. The series of waterfalls was important, not only to the health of the river and the people, it was a space that was used as a crossing, a possible fish and eel trapping area. Now, this area was frequented and shared by two different language groups. Above the waterfalls and to the north is the country of my ancestors, the Woiwurrung, and below is the neighbouring language group, the Bunjil. Altering a small tract of the river has huge consequences for the health of the people and the waterway and the intimate knowledge held within that tiny little space. So, who now is responsible for this distorted place? Alongside country being desecrated, our ancestors were rounded up and put onto missions. Aboriginal people were forced to abandon cultural practices, including language. One mission was established just outside Healesville and was named Coranderrk. The missionaries encouraged a new life of compromise while on the mission. They were to abandon their old beliefs and embrace European farming to survive in the new world thrust upon them. The people at Coranderrk began farming and worked the land to produce and harvest crops like wheat, oats, rye, along with vegetables, fruits from an orchard. They had a milking herd and cattle for beef. They grew hops. Now, hops in particular, along with other produce, was of a high quality and frequently won the highest prices at auction. Sadly, none of the profits were enjoyed by the people at Coranderrk. Recently, a small, dedicated group of people have been caring for a small part of the former Coranderrk Station. We have nourished the land by returning endemic species, improving the health of the waterways, which encourages animals to return, replenishing country by using regenerative farming, which can reinstate cultural practices and knowledge. When country is healthy, the people are healthy. Wan Birrarung, wan bikkurno, Kulanik bik wadamba ban yara jaranu. I come from the Birrarung, I come from the clay. My people heal and renew country. Nun Godjan, thank you.
My name is Dave Wandoon and I'm an elder of the Wurundjeri Tribal Land Council, but also on the board of directors here at what is left of Coranderrk Station. And I'm here to talk to you about the history of Coranderrk and what it means, not only in today's context, but what it means to me as an Aboriginal person. Coranderrk was set up in 1863 as a mission station after many failed attempts of finding suitable land for my ancestors. When they were walking back to Parliament House to look for new land, and as they came over what is now known as the Black Spur, they looked over this beautiful valley. They said, this is the place that we want. And that's where the story of Coranderrk begins. Because it wasn't something that was set aside by the government. It wasn't chosen by the government, it was chosen by our people. It was in actual fact the first land rights claim in Australia. Now, although it wasn't a native title land claim, it was a legislation set down by the government of the day that 4,800 acres of this land be set aside for my ancestors and many ancestors of other Aboriginal mobs in perpetuity. Of course, that means forever, but unfortunately nothing is forever. The idea of mission stations was to actually allow our people to die out. My people, in particular Simon Wonga, William Barrack, and the Aboriginal Superintendent John Green, actually made this place successful, and they made it a thriving community, and it was sustainable, and they cared for themselves. They grew many foods here, and in fact behind us, that hillside was all covered with vegetables. They ran their own cattle, pigs, chooks. They grew potatoes, corn, cabbages, whatever was available in the modern world. Because it was so successful though, people said it was too good for Aboriginal people. There was a famous inquiry held here into the state of Aboriginal people in Victoria, of which William Barrack was very influential. Unfortunately, it was a battle that was lost. So by the end of 1924, the land had all been carved up and our people were moved off to Lake Tyers, which is the last remaining mission still that's in existence today, but it's not a mission. It's actually run by Aboriginal people for Aboriginal people. And I'm standing here in front of the remaining building that was left on this place when it was carved up and sold off to early settlers. And it's where everybody, when they come here, they all want to see the house. It's a 2-storey, 11-room house. This house was built by my ancestors. The bricks were actually, the clay was quarried off this property and they were fired in a purposely built brick kiln to erect this house. So that's why it's important as a historical thing. What I see though, is it's the only building that remains. All the other buildings that my ancestors built were all torn down. So the thing was, when they closed this place down, they wanted to remove all evidence that it actually existed, and they left this monument behind. Now, we do have our elders living in this house, or one elder and his partner, so we've claimed it back. There it is. This is the easiest one to see here. If you have a good close look at all these bricks, they're not all fully symmetrical, they're not all the same colour because they didn't separate the clays, you know, they're very rough made bricks. But what some of our people did, and this is one that you can see quite easily, but there are bricks all throughout the building where they actually, as they were forming them, they actually left their initials into it. Just as a reminder for people as to who did what, how it was built and why it was built. And now what we're doing for Coranderrk is showing how we're going to do our old way of life as we move forward into this climate change. And now everybody's asking the Aboriginal people, you know, as we get through these devastating bushfires, they're asking us, the Aboriginal people, how did you live here for 65,000 years? And in the space of 200 years, we've actually managed to do a lot of damage to this country. So they're asking people about Indigenous land management, they're asking people about Indigenous culture and how can we use that knowledge alongside with new knowledge to improve not only Aboriginal people's lives, but all people who actually call Australia home. It's about what I call walking country together, healing country together, and thereby healing ourselves as people. So one of the things that we're going to do here is reintroduce our bush foods for people to taste, to actually get used to the fact that yes, there are plants out there that are not weeds, they're actually highly beneficial. And although it's in its very early infancy stage, we have some prime little examples of some of the plants that we're growing, and I'd like to talk to you about them. But what we've got here is an example of 3 different edible plants, and this one with the yellow flowers in front of us here is called the bulbine lily. Now to me, that is my favourite bush food vegetable. When it's cooked right, just think of your mum or your grandmother's best ever mashed potatoes that you've ever had, and that's what a bulbine lily is to me. And the second one we have, and the flowers are almost gone, and hopefully you can see them in camera, these little purple ones. And this is one that kids love. Its common name is the chocolate lily. And when it's fully flowering, it actually smells like a bar of chocolate. The problem with bush foods is, the bulbine lily you can eat, it needs to be cooked, but you can't eat it raw. The chocolate lily actually has to be cooked because it can actually make you crook. And if it's not cooked properly, but it's really no different than cooking, say, rhubarb, where you've got to, you don't eat the leaves. So there are things to learn or relearn about the cooking process and making sure that they're processed and handled properly. The most important one that I think everybody has heard about with the little yellow flowers, but it's called murnong. This was actually our staple food. This grew in abundance. I guess for Europeans it's the potato, and for the Chinese, for the Asian communities, it's rice. That's their staple diets. For us, the murnong was a staple diet. Colonisation, of course, sheep actually love this plant, and they almost annihilated it. It is a threatened species now, but it is actually easy to grow when you know what you're doing, and we hope to spread this out more in proportion to what we will to the other ones. They're a supplementary tasting, but this is something you can actually have a meal out of. And as we go into climate change, these will be the foods that everybody should be looking at as an easy to grow crop that is good for you and doesn't take a lot of room. So this is about climate change adaptability. How do we actually move forward? Could we just run cattle here like it's always been done? We can, but is it long-term sustainable for all the various food groups that we all need, which all the scientists tell us about, which was stuff that our ancestors knew. And as I walk through here, I imagine it in a few years' time, when it'll be all the native flowers, not only for the foods for us, but the native plants for all the other animals and birds and insects that can actually use that and get back to them having their native foods as well. And it's a long journey and it seems like it's a big job, but it can be done. We've shown the little bits that we have done are achievable. So I brought you to this little area because this bit of land that I'm staring at out over now, with that big old pine tree and the big oak tree over there, but the area of land I'm looking at now is the actual village of where our people lived. So we know about the house and where the superintendent lived, and where our people went in there and cleaned and looked after them. So were trained for domestic service and all those kind of things. But this is where they would actually, at the end of the day, come and live. And they weren't humpies, as people call them. They did start off building slab bark huts. And after a time it was realised that it was actually detrimental to their health because they couldn't move any further than this property without special permission. So they were trapped here for all the seasons. And of course, come to winter time, many young children did die here from the common cold. But there was tuberculosis, lots of diseases, because they couldn't go and forage further afield for the different medicines which actually still exist in the bush today. So what they did was they actually diverted the creek over the back there and built their own waterways, and were taught how to build a sawmill and how to use a sawmill. And from trees that were collected from nearby, they started up a sawmilling business and then built their own timber homes And of course the most prominent one, which of course none of that's here now, all of those were very, very quickly ripped down in the final closure in 1924. So we lose a bit of the story. This big old tree here, 3 metres in diameter across there, but there's absolutely nothing holding it up anymore. It's been blasted by lightning. It's had its top crown snapped off by winds. It's been burnt out several times, and yet it still functions. And that's got, you know, potentially 400 to 500 years of stories. And if trees could talk, and to me they do, that's a history timeline of what's happened here. But you know, it's going back way before colonisation. Yeah, I come here because I'm surrounded by the manigums. And in actual fact, the name Wurundjeri comes from the tree. And actually all of our language comes from the land. Wurrun means manigum, and Jerry is the grub that lives underneath the bark. The grub has an important part, not as a food, but the grub puts the designs in the bark. When you see all those artefacts in the museum, or you see them in the tourist trade, and there's drawings on them and paintings, the outline, or the tracing if you like, is what the grub leaves behind. And that's how you actually can write a story into that piece of bark. It's not just a piece of bark to carry around, it's actually significant. You would hang on to it all your life once you make it. My beautiful Yarra River, or the Birrarung as it's now called. This leads all the way into Melbourne, and it's from here that William Barrack began his walk for the petitions that he went to the government for, to actually protect this land for the future. So we have the manigum, which gives us as people the name Wurundjeri. We have the Yarra, who people recognise us as being the Yarra people, but the place which we declared home was named after this particular tree, the Coranderrk bush.
Sometimes I forget how much I know. Looking back on that film shows me the journey that I've been on. But there's a lot in there that's not said. I spoke more about the past and very little about the future. Since the making of that film, we have made steps. We have tread softly, small steps. We could easily get in the heavy machinery, sign up to the fertiliser companies, grow modern crops. But that's not sustainable, not on the small piece of land that we have. And particularly with the river running through it and the threats that it faces, not only from modern farming, but from population growth, from industrialisation. And in some way or another, just as Simon Wonga and William Barrack said, we need to show the country. We need to preserve our culture, even though this is only a small part of land where we can do that. We need to leave the demonstration behind for our children and our grandchildren to keep telling the story that there was a way to manage this country. That's an important part of the culture that we need to pass on. What we found during the making of that film, prior to that film, and since that film, the word has got out that there are Aboriginal people returning to their way of life. Not in the way of running around wearing possum skins and making spears and throwing boomerangs, but returning to their cultural responsibility. And as Brooke said, that is to care for country. And country will care for us. But it's not about just growing foods for ourselves. And I forgot that I said that in the film. It is about making sure that we keep the balance of the biodiversity, the ecological balance. Sure, we could clear this land and we could grow bush foods and go commercial and get them into our local supermarkets. But that will not help clean the waterways. It won't look after our wombats, our echidnas and our goannas. It won't look after our birds, and it will not look after the soil. And that is our cultural responsibility under Bunjil. That we must care for all things on our country. He didn't make us mean for us to be the superior being. He didn't give this land for us to own. He gave us the custodial right to care, not only for our people, but for all the things that are there, from the bottom of the ground to the top of the sky and everything in between. We are responsible for. So we have to think, how much food can we grow for ourselves? What effect will that have on the rest of the land around us? We've actually found that by sharing our land with the animals, with the trees, which we can't eat, but do have important medicines, we just haven't rediscovered those medicines yet, that everybody else, small farmers in particular, want to know how they can best use their land, how they're not beholden to the fertiliser companies, your John Deeres and your Kubota tractors. We don't have a tractor. We have a small ride-on. We have lots of hand tools and we have lots of volunteers. There have been barriers along the way, mostly economic barriers. COVID, of course, threw a big spanner in the works. But it actually made us more determined, or it's made me more determined to care for country. Because as Brooke said, healthy country, healthy people, no coronavirus. It is nature that gave us coronavirus because we have not listened to our creators. For us, it's Bunjil, but whoever your creator spirit might be, you know when you're doing the wrong thing, and we are all being punished. When we heal country, remembering what our creator asked us to do, we will have healthy country, no more epidemics. We have better medicines, healthier people, culturally, spiritually, physically. And as we walk around and look at our wildlife, which I call native life, not what wildlife, when you see them start to return, we'll know that we're doing our job, just like our ancestors did before colonisation, and we'll continue to do it. Give us this land and we will show you that we can work it. That was William Barrack's words, and we're making it come true still. Coranderrk only slept for a little while. We're waking it up again, and we will show the country.
Perfect, David. I'm being cheeky now. David is my cousin. I do have a question. It's a big one.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask you, and you can choose how you answer this. I wanted to ask you about some small or some big successes or challenges that we've had at Wandoon Estate in trying to regenerate the land.
Yeah, okay. None of them are big as yet, except for raising awareness to a broader community than just Wurundjeri. But I guess one of the things that really stood out for me, and it was not something we planned, but as in part of setting up part of our land as setting aside for conservation, and in particular for two threatened species, which is the helmeted honeyeater and the lowland leadbeater's possum, under very, very severe threat. We spent a lot of time reclassing the land, working how much land we could use for the cattle. To do that, we had to put in 6 kilometres of electric fencing. And so, yeah, keeping the cattle off some of the land wasn't suitable for them anyway. By accident, well, not by accident, somebody else knew there was a plant there, quite delicious, but it was one that we hadn't thought of. But by excluding the cattle, letting the land rest, and having a couple of years of floods that we have had, was the return of the water ribbon. You know, we knew it was there, and you could get a half a dozen tubers, if you knew what you were looking for. But yeah, not recently, a year ago, we went down there and we harvested a couple of hundred of them. And they're an absolutely beautiful food. We've shared them with some chefs from the local wineries, and shared them, of course, with the volunteers who got down there and helped us dig them up. And an absolutely beautiful vegetable. Why we don't have that, the chefs are saying, oh, this is going to be fantastic. It can replace the cucumber, the celery, the apple, because it's got all three flavours together. Fantastic mouth freshener. You can eat it raw. It's crunchy. It's juicy. It's refreshing. It's like, after eating it, it's just like you just finished brushing your teeth. And I think that was a classic example that by giving them the parts of the land time to rest, let the land tell you what it can provide, which then directs us what we're going to grow in our set aside areas to grow bush foods. So let the land tell us. It's not us telling the land what we want to do with it. So that's been an absolutely reward for taking our time, those small steps, and listening to country, observing what the country is doing for us. And then we know what to take the next step is. So that's the success that I see.
No arguments from me.
Now we're supposed to talk for 10 minutes. Oh no, we've already gone to 6.
Look at us, we're perfect on time. Well done.
I don't know, look, there is lots to talk about. Oh, so clear and full of promise. Can't wait to touch the soils. Yeah, that's the great thing. I would get a lot more done if I didn't have so many people that want to come and walk the land with me, which used to take about 1 hour. But with the new things we discover every day, it now takes about 3 hours to walk the property, to show what we have done, what we need to do, what steps we are, where some areas of land don't look as well looked after as they could be. But that's because there is a long range plan. It's not done by a 3-year election term or a 12-month funding. It's done long range, not for 5 years, not for 10 years, but as if for the next 1,000 years. So we have time to do all these things.
Thank you so much, Uncle Dave and Brooke. We look forward to hearing more from you in the moderated discussion that Alban will moderate a little bit later on. It's my very great pleasure now to introduce to you Yuni Sadaraya, who is an ADAT Indigenous activist and member of the Perempuan Aman, the Women's Association of the Indigenous Peoples Alliance of the Archipelago, a wing of Aman founded in 2012. And they focus on the situation of Indigenous women in Indonesia. Just a reminder to make sure that you have clicked the English button in interpretation so that you can hear the live translation. Over to you, Yuni, and welcome.
Selamat sore semua.
Good afternoon, everyone, and perhaps good morning for everyone somewhere else in different time zone. I'm Yuni Sadaraya. I am from East Kalimantan, Indonesia, specifically from the Adat community, Indigenous community in Pasir district. I would like to tell you about how the condition in my land. Perhaps you can see on my slide that Njaga Danum Tanah Ene Panyombulung, that is my traditional language, which means that we are the guardian of life and soil and land. Next slide, please.
Di wilayah kami, di tempat kami,
where we
kami
live,
ada kehidupan kami selalu berkaitan dengan hutan, berhubungan
our
dengan
life is
hutan.
always related to the forest, and we have different categorizations of the forest. Alas, for example, this is the primary area with big trees, and this part, this area is separated into different categories. Alas Mori, for example, is the sacred part of the forest that we cannot touch. This is for the magical creatures, because we believe, the WEAC group, we believe in that there are other lives apart from human lives. So there should be a place, sacred place that would be specially designed for them. And then we have sipung. This is the part of the forest that we maintain for important trees, for fruits, and we cannot process the land. And then we have loti, and then we have orok. However, we used to be dependent on the forest because it is from the forest that we get our food, our medicines. But lately, in 1970s, the forest destruction took place with the timber company. We have two timber companies coming into our land at the time. We have PT Ranamas and PT Rempua, and this forest destruction continued. And there was this effort by the government to control our land with the land certification program. And we who were managing the forest communally, we were forced to parcel out the land, the forest, because of the certification program. And then we had the palm oil company, and this was the beginning of the significant destruction in our land, because since then our forest, which was a primary forest, this was opened and it was turned into palm oil plantation and the area for transmigration, and people are were transmigrating from other places to our land. And then in 1995, the government again introduced the program, the plantation program for palm oil plantation. This was for the local farmers. And the land that was owned by the people, local people, was turned into palm oil plantations, palm oil plots, with the government providing subsidies for fertilizers and pesticides. And the requirement to access this assistance was for the land certification. So the people who did not know about land certifications, they went in droves to make sure that the land has been certified. And apart from the forest, we also have different areas. We have the Tanah Selarat, Tanah Lolati, Tanah Moru, and other kind of areas. And this separation of areas has been there from the olden times. But then when the government forced us to change, because our system, we moved out to work in different areas of the forest, but the government want us to stay in one area, so they moved us from our our plots, from our lands. They moved us to the side of the road, and this new settlement was called Sitra. And we were forced to leave our lands, our crops, our plantation, and when they want to go to the paddock, they would be discriminated against. So they were forced to live in Setarat, in the settlement, and if they want to go to the paddock, they had to go in the evening or at night. This was around 1945, so even before the independence, or since the beginning of the independence in Indonesia. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And we also separated the river into different parts. So we separated the river into different parts, and each part has a distinct meaning to us. We call Loyu, this is the deepest part of the river, or people call it Lubuk as well. And in these different areas of the river, they have different functions. In Loyu, or in the deepest part of the river, this is where the specific fish are. So this is the calm area of the river. And this separation of the river, they have their own functions and they have their own biodiversity. This is, and also how we treat them would be different. When the palm oil companies came to our areas, we started to feel the lack of water. We were forced to buy water. And we also took the water from the river for the people with vehicles. As you can see on the slide, people having vehicles, they took these big drums to the river, and they also took jerry cans to the river. But that was only available. This is only available for people with having vehicles. If you don't have vehicles, you have to carry everything by hand. And so the people who carried the water using the vehicles, they sell the water to the people who do not have access to the river. So every year, we have to buy the water. Every year, it's around 700 to 1 million rupiah, and this also depends on the number of family members in the family. And we also used to have the crops. We have this tradition. We have 90 stages of crop planting, starting from opening the land and also for the post-harvest. When we plant the crops, we always do in the community, and we always have the rituals as a way to communicate with our ancestors, with the owners and the rulers of the forest. So when we opened the land, for example, that we have to provide offerings, we have to pray, we have to cut or kill the trees. So we ask permission for us to be able to open the land, and we also ask for the animals to move out of the area because we want to open the land. And when we open the land, there will be signs or communication between the humans and the nature. For example, when we open the land, we have to consider the stars in the sky. Even if the sky is appropriate, the stars in the sky is appropriate, but then there is this natural sign that would not allow us to open the land, then we can't open the land. In that place, we have to move to another place. And when we open the land, usually there will be exchanges of seeds among the community members because we always open the land communally. So we never do this individually. Next slide, please. And when we open the land, usually we replenish the trees. We replant the trees so to replenish the land because we have cut down trees, and we can only work on the land in 3 years. And then we will replenish the land to plant the trees again, and then they will leave the land until the trees are big, so around 5 to 10 years. When we open the land, the people
pestisida.
do
Biasanya
not use
mereka lebih
pesticides.
kepada
Usually,
pestisida alam.
they
Biasanya
use natural
mereka itu
pesticides.
sangat ini dengan sangat sangat memperhatikan dengan
They
kelestarian
usually
lingkungan. Misalnya
really
ketika ada hama
consider
tikus, mereka
the
tidak akan
natural
membunuh
balance.
tapi
When we
justru
have
mereka melakukan ritual
rats,
memberi
for
makan
example, we don't kill the rats, but we do
agar tidak
rituals
mengganggu
to
tanaman
ask
padi
the rats to
mereka.
ensure that the rats do not
Berbeda dengan
disturb
sekarang. Ketika
the
sekarang
crops. This is different from what we
tikus yang masuk
do
di
now.
ladang,
When we have
orang-orang akan
rats in the
meracuni, memberi
field,
racun
people will
tikus
poison the
dengan
rats.
ramai-ramai. Tapi ketika zaman dulu itu
But
tidak. Mereka tidak
previously,
melakukan ritual,
we
mereka
did
kasih
not
makan
do
itu
this.
tikus
We
agar tidak
made a
mengganggu
ritual.
ladang
We
mereka.
provide food for the rats so that the
Saat
rats
pembukaan
would
ladang ini
eat that
juga,
food and
penanaman
not the
ladang
crops.
ini mereka selalu
And
melakukan tanam tumpang sari.
we also
Di situ
do
mereka
intercropping.
menanam sayur mayur,
So
sehingga
we
mereka tidak
plant
pernah kekurangan
vegetables.
pangan. Beda
So
dengan
we
sekarang.
never have a lack of
Saat
food.
sekarang ketika
Now
mereka
it's
menanam
different.
padi, mereka tidak akan
When we
melakukan tanaman tumpang sari.
plant
Selain itu juga
rice,
mereka
we no
melakukan
longer do
menggunakan
intercropping.
pestisida, pupuk
And
kimia, sehingga memang itu berpengaruh
we
kepada
use
kesuburan tanah tadi.
pesticides or chemical fertilizers which will affect the fertility of the soil. Next slide, please.
Dengan adanya hutan,
With
dengan
the
adanya hutan,
forest,
biasanya kami kearifan tradisional kami sangat terjaga.
our
Biasanya
traditional
kami
wisdom
meramu
is
obat-obatan,
maintained. For
misalnya
example,
obat
usually we
setelah
have the
melahirkan,
medicines
obat luka,
for
obat
post-delivery,
flu. Bahkan kemarin ketika
for
musim
wound,
pandemi, kami
and
juga
during the pandemic
mencari
time,
obat-obatan dari
at the
hutan
height of the pandemic,
sebagai
we
pencegahan
tried to go
dari
to the forest to find
meringankan gejala dari
plants, medicinal plants
tersebut.
that would
Nah,
alleviate
di
the
beberapa
symptoms
keluarga
of
itu
COVID.
selalu rutin dikerjakan,
And
walaupun sekarang
we
tidak
usually do this in the
seintensif dulu,
families,
karena memang
although this was not as
ketika
intensive as,
hutan
this is
kami
no longer as
hilang,
intensive
ketika
as
hutan kami
we did
berkurang,
before,
jumlah
because we have
obat-obatan ini
a
juga
lack
hilang,
of
berkurang.
forest, we have
Selanjutnya
reduced
juga kami juga
area of the forest, so the
melakukan
forest produce is reduced as well.
regenerasi pengetahuan,
And
termasuk
we
pengetahuan
also
tentang pengelolaan air,
try to regenerate
pengetahuan
the
tentang
knowledge about, including the knowledge about
keterampilan-keterampilan,
waterways,
misalnya seperti
knowledge about
menganyam,
skills,
seperti,
weaving skills,
pengolahan pangan. Kalau
and
zaman
to process
dulu,
the food,
kami ada di
the food staples.
di kami itu ada
In the olden times,
semacam syarat ketika seorang perempuan
there
ingin
was
menikah,
this
dia
requirement
harus bisa
when
menganyam.
a woman
Ketika dia tidak bisa menganyam, dia tidak
wish
boleh,
to
dia
marry,
belum boleh
wish to
menikah.
get
Itu syarat
married,
dari
they
orang tua dulu. Tapi
she
itu
would
dulu.
need
Sekarang tidak lagi.
to be able to
Sekarang
weave,
tidak lagi orang menikah,
but
tidak lagi menggunakan
now
syarat
this is
itu.
not the case.
Karena di
When
dalam
a girl wants
anyaman
to
itu
marry,
sendiri
they don't
sebetulnya
need
banyak
to be able to weave.
filosofi yang
But in the weaving
yang sangat penting.
tradition, there is this
Bagaimana
important
menjaga alam,
knowledge
bagaimana
and
filosofi
philosophy on how to take care of the land,
itu banyak
how to
sekali.
take
Tapi
care of
karena
the
adanya modernisasi,
nature. But
anak-anak
with the
lebih
modern
senang memegang,
life,
HP,
the
gadget,
youngsters
belajar
are
menganyam.
more familiar with the
Sehingga di
mobile
zaman
phones
sekarang,
rather
menganyam
than
ini
weaving.
menjadi hal
So
yang
now
langka
weaving
di suku
is
kami.
something
Kami
that
lebih
is
senang membeli tas
rarely
dari
done
pasar,
in our
membeli,
community.
plastik-plastik,
We go to the
kantongan
market to
plastik
buy
untuk tempat
bags, to
barang,
buy
untuk
plastic
tempat
bags
belanjaan, tidak seperti
for
orang-orang tua
our
dulu
shopping.
yang selalu
So not
membuat
like
anyaman
what
sendiri
our
yang
ancestors
mereka
did.
jadikan sebagai
Our
tas.
grandmothers
Nah,
used to
selain itu
weave
juga
their
kalau dulu
bags.
untuk
And
pangan
in the
lokal
olden
itu
times, for the local
dilakukan
food,
pengolahannya itu secara tradisional. Misalnya
we process this traditionally.
dompang itu
For example, the dompang,
misalnya kita
we
mendapatkan
usually
rusa,
dry
itu
out
dagingnya
the
kita
dompang,
jemur, kita
or
asapin.
if
Itu tahan
we get
bertahun-tahun. Tapi kalau sekarang tidak.
get
Sekarang
a deer,
lebih banyak
we
dijual, bahkan
dry
ada
the deer
juga
in
yang
the
disimpan di kulkas.
meat in the
Nah,
sun.
dulu
But now
juga
it's not the same. Now we have
kita
fridges.
melakukan makanan itu,
We put
ada
the
beberapa makanan
food in the fridge,
tradisional yang hasil
and
dari pengolahan itu seperti
we also
dompang.
have the
Nah,
local
itu
food,
yang
the
dijemur,
dompang, as I've
kemudian itu yang
mentioned,
difermentasi namanya
and also
pekasang.
fermented food.
Nah, tapi itu sekarang sudah jarang sekali ditemukan.
But now we
Nah, selain itu juga
do this very rarely.
bagaimana ketika
And also
penanganan pasca
how
panen, misalnya
to
kita
do the
menanam
post-harvest
kacang atau jagung,
process when we plant peanuts, for example, or corn. And after we harvest the peanuts and the corns, we also store some of the seeds in the soot, and the seeds would stay for a year. And now it's different. For we use pesticides, and worse, now we buy seeds instead of local seeds, which were the staple food for our community. And if we use local seeds, or if we don't use local seeds, then we would depend on fertilizers and pesticides. Next slide, please. And the role of the indigenous women is significant, especially as the guardian of the resilience of life and the community, because the knowledge, 75% of 90% of traditional knowledge is owned by women, and it is the women who would then provide the legacy to the children in terms of this knowledge. And in this regard, the women build the norms, the values, and with this knowledge, we take care of the nature of the environment. For example, when the women use or try to find plants for the weaving, as you can see in my slide, this is a bag for seeds. When they try to get the plants to make the weaving materials, they don't just take the plant, but there are certain types, and also they only do this in certain period of time, so not throughout the year. And why do they do this only in certain times? Because they provide the opportunity for the bamboos or for the rattan to be replenished and to grow. Because if we keep on taking the plants without any rest, then there is no opportunity for the plant to grow. But when the women use this certain time periods, then the bamboo and the rattan will have time to grow. Next slide, please. Where I live, as I told you, this was a forest area. But when the land was opened, continuously opened, you can see what the condition is at the moment. You can see that there is this small green part around the river. At the downstream and also the upstream, we only have a little bit of forest, and in the middle, this is where the palm oil plantations are, and also the transmigration settlements. The locals live along the road that cross the area in the middle. So you can imagine during the flood, during the rainy season, or in the dry season. In the rainy season, there's always flood. There's only a little bit of rain and we have flood. During the dry season, just for 2 weeks, then this would lead us to a lack of clean water, and we are forced to buy the water. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, even after 9 months of dry spell, they never have a lack of clean water from the river. And around our community, people are trying to get food, and there's the mangrove area where try to get the crabs, the snails, the fish, and in the upstream area, this is used for the clean water provision and also for reconnecting, and also for find traditional medicines. And this is not only for the this is not only true for the Rangan people in our community, but also in the other or used by other indigenous groups. Next slide, please. In 2018 and 2019, the Indigenous Women Association did a research, and it turned out that because of this customary land destruction, so 70% of the area have become the land concession area. And most of the indigenous women became workers in the company with low wages and very restricted access to the land. So what we were able to get from the land, from the forest, we could not get anymore. So 64%, 64.5% is the restriction to the traditional practices that affects food resilience of the community. And the indigenous women were criminalized or are criminalized because of our traditional practices. And when we want to do the traditional practices, this is seen as a violation of the law. For example, the practices of burning in our area, or the traditional midwives. The traditional midwives were no longer allowed to practice. So in this, the sandro or the traditional midwife, when they do the practice without any modern midwives, this was seen as a violation of the law, and they would be punished by the government. And this happened especially when in the beginning of the law, when the law was first issued. Now we know more about this. So with the opening of the land, our community are no longer able to practice their knowledge. The knowledge about weaving, for example, this is owned only by the elderly, not by the youngsters. Not only because we don't have the materials to do this, there is also this rules. For example, the traditional medicines. When I was a child, when they had disease or illnesses, we had rituals. But now with the introduction of the modern medicines and the religions, we don't do the rituals anymore. And also because we don't have any more access to the forest, we don't have the materials to do the rituals. Next slide, please. When we have a reduced area of the forest, then we have a reduced supply of food. And this was evident during the pandemic. In the beginning of the pandemic, we had this large-scale social restriction in Indonesia. I don't know whether this happened also in other places, but in Indonesia, we had this large-scale movement restrictions, and people were no longer able to go to access the market, for example,
pangan yang ada di
we
kampung mereka.
were
Bahkan
forced to
juga
rely on the
karena
food
kemarin
that would be available
ada
in the
pembatasan untuk
village.
keluar kampung,
And because we
akhirnya
had this
bahan
movement
baku,
restriction
bahan
that
pangan
would
yang
not
datang
allow
dari
us to
luar
go
pun itu
outside of the
dibatasi
village,
untuk masuk di
we
kampung,
also
di
had a
kampung.
lack
Sehingga
of
kami hanya mengandalkan yang ada di
food
kampung. Nah, di
supplies
sini bisa
coming from
dilihat bahwa
outside of the
ketika
village.
memang
So we had
kampung
to
itu masih
rely
memiliki
on the
hutan yang baik, masih
food
memiliki
supplies
wilayah
from the
kelola yang
village
baik,
itself.
memiliki
And
air
you
yang
can see
baik,
that if the village had a good supply,
masyarakat masih
has
bisa
a good
bertahan
supply and good access
dengan
to land,
apa ya,
to river,
dengan
and to the forest,
keadaan,
people
dengan
are
kekayaan
able to
alam yang
survive
ada.
with
Sementara
this
di kampung-kampung yang
rich
sudah seperti
biodiversity.
contohnya Rangan
But
sendiri
now
itu
in Rangan, for
agak
example,
sulit untuk
it is
bertahan
quite
karena
difficult
mereka
for us to
orang-orang
survive
Rangan
because the
mengandalkan
Rangan
pasokan
community
pangan dari luar.
now rely on
Sehingga
the
kemarin sempat
external
terjadi
supply of food.
kelangkaan
So we had a
beberapa bahan
time when we saw
dari penutupan apa keluar masuk akibat dari
lack
PSBB
of
tersebut.
food supplies as a result
Masyarakat
of
itu
the
terpaksa yang tadinya
movement restriction in the beginning of the
semua harus
pandemic.
membeli, mau
And
tidak mau mereka harus mengais-ngais
people
apa yang
were
ada
forced
di
to
wilayah adat
try
mereka.
to get
Misalnya
whatever
yang
they
tadinya
could
mereka semua
from
harus
the
membeli
area.
ikan, harus membeli sayur.
We were
Akhirnya ketika mereka
used
memang
to
tidak
buy
punya akses
food,
keluar, mereka terpaksa
and
mencari
when
ikan
we
di
had
sungai-sungai mereka.
this
Walaupun
movement
dengan
restriction and we
keadaan
could
yang
not go
mungkin
out,
sangat
we had to
beda
go to
dengan
the
zaman
river
dulu. Kalau dulu
and
kan
try to get
sangat
all the food from
mudah
the river,
mendapatkannya.
from the
Sekarang
forest, and it was
sangat sulit untuk mendapatkan ikan
quite
dalam
difficult
jumlah
for
banyak.
us to get
Sementara
fish, for
orangnya juga
example.
semakin,
This is not
manusianya juga semakin
like
banyak
what
yang
we had in the
mengkonsumsi
in
dan
the olden days, because now
persediaan
we have a
ikan
bigger
ataupun sayur
population
mayurnya juga semakin
and
sedikit.
we
Nah,
have
itu sangat terasa sekali
lower
kemarin.
supply
Nah,
of
selain itu juga
vegetables in the area,
saya
and
mungkin akan
also
bercerita juga
fish.
terkait perkebunan kelapa sawit.
And
Nah,
I would
perkebunan
also
kelapa
like
sawit
to
ini
tell you
sebetulnya
about
sangat
the palm oil
sangat ini ya, sangat
companies.
mempengaruhi
The palm oil
terhadap
companies
lingkungan Rangan.
affect
Ya, seperti saya
significantly the
ceritakan
life
di
in
awal,
Rangan. As
perkebunan
I've
kelapa
mentioned
sawit ini
before, these palm oil
menghabiskan
companies
hutan-hutan kami, sehingga bukan hanya
opened up the
pengetahuan
land in
dan
our forest.
pangan kami
So
yang
not only our knowledge and our
tergerus,
land that
apa
was
namanya,
that
ikut
were
musnah,
undermined
tapi juga
or
apa ya,
threatened,
sosial budaya kami juga ikut
but our
musnah.
social and
Kenapa?
cultural
Karena
lives were affected as well.
banyak apa ya, banyak hal-hal yang
Because
biasanya
there
kami
are so
lakukan
many
dengan cara
things that we used to
bergotong royong, dengan
do
cara bekerja
communally
dengan,
in
bersama-sama,
collaboration
tapi ketika sistem
together with
perkebunan masuk,
others.
semua
But when we have
upah,
these
semua harus
palm
digaji,
oil
tidak ada
companies,
lagi
everyone
gotong royong
relied
ketika
on wages. So it's no longer about
pembukaan
collaboration,
ladang,
about
ketika pembukaan kebun tradisional,
about
itu
communal
masyarakat baru
work,
melakukan
the
bergotong royong. Tapi
opening
ketika
of
di
the
perkebunan
land,
kelapa
for
sawit,
example,
semua dilakukan
we
dengan
did
cara
this
upah.
communally.
Nah, itu
But
di
then
sisi
when
sosial
with the
budayanya.
introduction of
Nah,
the
di sisi
palm oil
lain
company,
juga secara
everyone
ekonomi, mungkin
started
orang
to
akan
receive
melihat
wages.
bahwa
So that's about the
ketika dia mempunyai
social and
kebun kelapa
cultural lives.
sawit,
And then about
kehidupannya
the
akan terjamin,
economical aspect,
kehidupannya akan
people started to see,
dia
oh,
akan
when
selalu
they have these
ada uang.
palm oil
Padahal
plantations, then they would be better
orang-orang
off.
Juga merasa apa ya, merasa merasa tertekan dengan adanya perkebunan kelapa sawit.
But
Kenapa? Karena
people feel
sekalipun dia
depressed as
memiliki
well with the palm oil
lahan atau
companies,
perkebunan yang luas, tetapi
because
karena
even though they have these big
penjualan kelapa
areas
sawit mereka tergantung dengan harga CPO dunia, sehingga
where
mereka
the
tidak punya hak, tidak punya
oil palms
kebebasan
are planted,
untuk
but the price of the
menjual,
the price of the products would depend on the crude palm oil price in the world. So they had no control of the price.
Saat harga minyak di Indonesia
And
naik,
when
harga kelapa sawit di sini hanya
when
dihargai
the price of the oil increases,
1.500 dengan atau 1.400 per kilogram.
palm oil
tidak
fruits
seimbang dengan harga
was not
saat itu.
getting a good
Sehingga,
price at the
juga
time.
sebetulnya apa ya, yang dijanjikan pemerintah bahwa
And
dengan penanaman
what is
kelapa sawit
promised
masyarakat
by
akan
the
mudah
government
dan
that
sejahtera, itu
if they
apa ya,
have this
tidak benar.
palm oil plantation, then you would be better
Sebetulnya
off.
kami lebih
That
sejahtera
doesn't
ketika hutan kami
turn
masih
out to
bagus,
be
karena
true.
kami tidak
We were
perlu
better
membeli
off when
food,
we
tidak perlu
still
membeli
had the
ikan,
forest
tidak perlu
intact,
membeli
because
sayur,
then
bahkan kami
we did
tidak
not
perlu
have
membeli
to
minyak.
buy fish, we did
Kami
not
cukup
have to
menanam
buy
kelapa membuat minyak sendiri.
vegetables. We did not even have to buy oil because we used coconut oils. But now when we have the palm oil plantation, we no longer have the access to get the vegetables or the fish. And a lot of the people plant palm oil, and then people forget to plant coconut trees. Then we are forced to depend on the oil coming from outside of the community. And considering the situation, we in the Rangan community, we tried to create an awareness among the people to maintain the customary lands, the remaining customary lands that we have. And in 2019, we started to do reconsolidation, and we're trying to protect our land. Now we're in the process to get the recognition for the customary land, for the remaining forests that we have. And we're doing the process to try to get the recognition for the community, indigenous community. And why is this important? Because there is this bigger threat that's facing us apart from these corporations and the palm oil companies. And this is the new capital city, and the new capital city would be moved from Jakarta to East Kalimantan. It is only 100 kilometers away from us. So the new capital city would be only 100 kilometers away from us. And since we have this plan to have the capital city moved to East Kalimantan, this has triggered a new conflict for us. Not only do people come to this area to get land, this has also created a horizontal conflict among the community members, because we had the struggle for lands, and we have a lot of struggles because of the land. And there are many companies that would be opened in our areas. We have this port, the coal port, for example. This will all be opened and started in our areas. This will be a distinct challenge for us, and we try to protect our land and our community through the recognition for the customary land and also this indigenous community. Although this process has been quite protracted from 2019 until now, we have not seen the light at the end of the tunnel, but we keep on trying, although the government has not responded well to our demand. So I think that's it from me. Thank you very much. Good afternoon.
Thank you so much, Uni, for that incredible presentation, and Brooke and Uncle Dave and Uni for the passionate way in which you all care for country. We've just learnt so much in such a short space of time. We're now going to turn to our moderated discussion. Our facilitator tonight is Alban Manisi, is a landscape urbanist, founder and director of Scape Ethical, built environmental practice and research platform. Alban's research focus is on emerging political ecology, implementation and landscape planning, and the social ecology deployment through various Indigenous environmental mediations. All of our speakers will be in conversation with Alban, and with the addition of course, Tiriki Onus, head of the Willan Centre of Indigenous Arts and Cultural Development at the University of Melbourne, and of course a Yorta Yorta man who is a very successful visual artist, curator, performance artist and opera singer. So over to you, Alban. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for all participants. Well, now we have 1 hour to discuss all together. Maybe a little bit less than 1 hour. We are going to make sure that you all have dinner on time. I'm just going to have different questions. I'm going to have a slide just for the audience and the participant, just to know where we are. We are going to have different moments. It's going to be helpful for everybody. For the audience, you already know, I heard about the damn COVID, but you already know how to use Zoom. So there is this Q&A tab. You might be able, regarding the topic, to put your questions that we might have normally still 20 minutes at the end to respond sometimes to more precise questions to what has been said before or what we are going to go through now. Even a lot has been said. So I'm going to share my slide. Sorry for the time I take. Yes, so voilà. So we have the 4 person, the 3 participants we had, Wandoon, Dave Wandoon was already here, Yoni Sadara, who was from Indonesia, and now we have Tiriki Onus, who's finally helping us to give another aspect about Indigenous issue. We know that we are going to talk a lot about dirty word, heavy word that we all heard on TV, in university with our friends in a bar or restaurant, about different type of epistemology, different type of way to understand the history from environment, how the ontology, how do we live when we try to decolonize, how we try now to start to learn indigenous engineering, how we've been through with Yoni, with Brooke and Dave. There is a lot to learn, how finally we already have people do resistance. So what I'm going to start is also paying respect for people who already do the job, as we see here, but also to understand that we need to start the conversation where we really are. So this is fantastic to have this conversation today, thanks to the TarraWarra Museum, but there is a lot who has been done already. So the past century, I'm just going to do a very, very short presentation, 2-3 minutes. The past century was a way for us to renew a lot of what we call environmental history. A lot of resistance were completely forbidden, hidden from the history of where we are, how we do the environment today. Just now we start to have resistance. We are back to the history, pretty much like what we have with Coranderrk, pretty much what we have in Indonesia, what we have here in Japan. Some people who finally were not part of this history written by the winner, because people who resist sometimes had to do something else. They are not part of the system and they disappear. And usually we consider because they fail, they are not part of the history. So there is a lot going on. You've seen today 3 presentations. This is part of it. But there is also a lot taught in university. So we have here people from Melbourne who are already part of the academy. So since 50 years, this type of acknowledgement is part of the program. So there is also for you a lot to learn, but also a lot to acknowledge. The job is done. So the main concern we have with the participant today is why such knowledge is not implemented. If we already know, if we already recognize the problem, how come, and we heard that on the question, how come people do not recognize the benefit to use this type of environmental ethics? One of the main reasons, and this is where we're going to start, is because exogenous society who come to a land and indigenous people who emerge from a land have very different environmental ethics. My way of doing, my way, because I'm very white, I'm very French, is about destruction. We start to talk today about what we call speculative city, speculative environment. Our system, and you know that from the phone, we create models who have to be obsolete, who have to be broken to be able to sell another one. This is how we do. This is how you see in Indonesia. We don't care about the biodiversity because it does not help us. We need to destroy it. And this is what you see in your apartment, in your agriculture. Sometimes it doesn't work. It was planned in order to sell another one. But this is also part of the whole lexicon we have. So we are here on the soil project. So what I'm going to ask our participant is finally, how can you explain to us a different notion of soil? Because for us, the soil is a commodity. I was starting the presentation with the sand. For Westerner, usually the sand is not a soil because we are not doing anything with it. But the soil is an entity. So you have a very different way to name, to understand the environment. And I'm going just to make sure this conversation, we are not repeating what we already know. Try to tell us what we do wrong. Up to you. Any one of you? Brooke, Dave.
Where do we start?
Absolutely, yeah.
Great little teaser, Alban. I'd like to say, if that's okay, I think, excuse me, we see ourselves separate to country as a general community. We see ourselves separate to the land and the ways of all of our ancestors, of the beautiful people that are on screen with me tonight. I'm going to assume that the way that you have been taught is that you are equal to the worm, you are equal to the star, you are equal to the tree, and you treat them as if it is your mother or your auntie or your really tough uncle who's going to tell you off if you don't follow the rules. I think that's where we start. And if I am going to fully accept myself as a sovereign Birrarung woman, I have to love the country where I've come from, because I believe I come from the clay.
We can carry on, maybe.
Yep.
Yeah,
no worries. These days, when I do a welcome to country, where maybe people have never heard a welcome to country before, and they don't actually understand the process of what a welcome is. Part of the welcome is to lay down the law. You know, while I welcome people onto my country, what laws do they have to obey? And Bunjil, our creator, gave us many laws, but they all stem from one law, and that is we must respect our mother. Not only our physical mother that we are born from, the first person we have in contact as we take our first breath is our physical mother. And she is the one that feeds us, clothes us, keeps us warm, gives us medicine, keeps us safe, does all of these things. As we grow older as children, under our community, our cultural law, we return that favour to our physical mother as she gets older and is no longer able to care for herself. But the other half of the equation is we must remember the spirit of our mother. And the spirit of our mother is the land and the waters. It is the soil. And it has nurtured our ancestors for thousands and thousands of years. But if we don't continue those practices, it will not nurture our generations into the future. So we must respect the land, the soils, as we would respect our physical mother for everything that she provided. Because our lands are getting old. They are older than people, and they are not an infinite resource, and they never were. They do need replenishing. And this is, I know this is a common thread through all Indigenous communities around the world, where they have some influence, that they have shown by demonstration that by sticking to those principles, that they actually have healthier soils. Unfortunately, because we have created these healthy spaces, that then becomes an economic demand to someone, as we've heard from Yerni. And I could feel your frustration, Yerni. I could almost say the words as they were being interpreted to me, knowing the next words you were going to say, because we have been on that journey. As soon as you do something good, and Brooke spoke about it when, and I did on the film too, that as soon as we showed that we could actually make this land productive under a new system, they took it away from us. And we didn't have access to that land anymore, therefore destroying what little bit of culture we had left. We, here in Australia, have been lucky enough to actually own land. It's only 200 acres, but having that ownership, that land that you're trying to get back for yourself, having ownership of that, relieves a lot of the pressure of what you can and can't do. There's a difference between ownership, custodianship, and somebody gifting you land and allowing you access. There are three different accesses to land. Unfortunately, in the modern world, you have to own it, whereas under traditional culture, you only have custodial rights over it. And that is the best way to look after the land, to look after the soils, because those custodial rights fall under that 50% of the equation, the spirit of mother, and mother is the soil. We call it Naam. It's the land on which we walk. And we have to respect it like we would our own mother. When we're walking across land, when we're traveling the rivers, we're traveling through our mother's veins and her arteries. You know, that water goes out into the bay, which we know culturally goes out there to the heart of the ocean and is returned back through the hair of the mother that comes through the skin, which is the land. And from that, the trees grow. And as it's taken in through the mouth and it is processed and it produces our fish and our animals, our worms and our insects and our snakes and our spiders, but also our medicines and also our shelter. All of those things come from our mother. And that's how we look at soil. The soil is our mother.
Yoni, if you want, but we haven't heard Tiriki since the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah. Kami memandang bahwa tanah
Yes,
ini adalah
we think that the land is ourselves because
legenda yang ada di suku kami,
according to the
kami
legend that we
tercipta
have
dari
in our
awal
community,
mula kami tercipta adalah dari tanah, sehingga
we were
kami sangat
created from
menghargai
land.
tanah.
So we
Dan bukan hanya
respect
tanah
the
sebetulnya,
land and the
semua
soil,
apa yang
and
ada
not
di dalam
only the
tanah.
land,
Oleh
but
sebab itu,
everything
setiap kali
inside
kami
the land,
melakukan sesuatu,
inside the
kami
soil.
harus
So
melakukan
everything we
ritual.
do something, we
Ritual
have
ini
to do a
adalah
ritual. And this
sarana
ritual
komunikasi kami,
is a
baik
way for us
komunikasi
to
dengan
communicate.
Makhluk-makhluk yang ada di dalam tanah
Communicate
maupun
with the
makhluk-makhluk
creatures
kasat
in the
mata
soil
yang dan
and
kami
also
percaya
the
makhluk-makhluk itu ada,
creatures
sehingga
that cannot be seen, but
saat
we believe that they're
sebelum melakukan
there.
sesuatu
So before
perlu
we do
adanya
something, we
melakukan
have
ritual-ritual
to
tersebut,
do these
komunikasi-komunikasi tersebut.
rituals, this communication.
Kami juga
And
menghargai tanah sebagai diri
we
kami.
also
Oleh sebab
respect
itu,
land as part of
sebetulnya di dalam
ourselves. And that's
komunitas
why
kami itu
in our
tidak
community,
ada istilah jual beli tanah.
there is
Kami
no
mendapat sumpah ketika kami menjual
tradition
tanah. Tapi
about
itu
sales
ketika
of
kami
land.
masih
We would
berpegang
be
dengan
cursed if we sell land.
budaya kami.
But
Tapi
this is when we
seiring
still
berjalannya waktu
use
dan
our
masuknya kapitalis
tradition.
semua berubah.
But as time goes
Dan
on,
hanya
the
sebagian orang yang
capitalism
masih
entered
berpegang
the
pada,
area. Everything
prinsip bahwa
changed,
tanah
and only
adalah
a few
milik
people
kami,
that
dan
still
tanah
hold
tidak
on to the
boleh
principle that
diperjualbelikan.
this land
Hanya
is
sedikit
part of
orang yang masih
us,
memegang
and the land
prinsip
cannot
itu.
be sold. And
Banyak
only
orang
just a
yang
few people still
sudah
maintain that
berpikir
principle.
bahwa
Many
tanah
people
adalah
have
komoditi yang
changed
bisa
and already
diperjualbelikan,
think
bisa
that the land
menghasilkan
is
uang,
actually a
bisa
commodity
mendatangkan
that they
keuntungan,
can sell,
sehingga
that can
tidak
bring
lagi
money, can bring
memandang
profit.
bahwa tanah
So they
adalah
no
bagian
longer
dari
see
dirinya.
the land
Sehingga
as
tanah
part
dengan
of
mudah
themselves,
diperjualbelikan.
and then they can
Nah,
easily sell
dalam hal
land.
ini
And in this
kami
case,
sebagian masyarakat
we
berupaya
or
untuk
a part of the community
mematahkan ini, mencegah ini,
try to
sehingga
break
kami
this
berupaya
opinion.
merekonstruksi lagi
So we try to
adat-adat yang ada.
reconstruct
Misalnya
the traditional
upacara-upacara
knowledges and
ini,
also the rituals.
direkonstruksikan kembali,
We try to reconstruct
dan
the
untuk dilakukan
rituals
kembali
and
agar,
to re-implement those rituals to ensure that the spirit
terhadap tanah ini masih
and the
terus
love
melekat di
for the
dalam diri
land
setiap orang yang
will
ada di
stay
tempat kami.
in every one of us
Seperti itu.
who
Terima
live
kasih.
here in the community. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So maybe Tiriki, we are going to move on. You still have plenty of space to, because the next question is almost the same. I'm just following. We talk about the same topic. So in order to make sure that we are on time, I'm just going to get back to the presentation. Because it's, yes. Yes. So finally, you all heard about this notion of extractivism. This is mainly what we heard from, you know, there was some people who come from different religions, but mainly Christian and Protestant. And finally, this is how we understand why the environment was created. it's here for the use of human beings. This is something that we never heard from your understanding, and this is something that you don't even can calculate. The debate does not work at all. So finally, from this type of what we call delinquent political ecology, because we are pretty much like gangster, we take it, and if it's not working anymore, but we move to another place and we leave it as it is. There is a region on Earth who are completely invalidate for agriculture. It's dead forever. So they were not nurtured. So my second question is finally, how the Wurundjeri, but also the Ada, we are not going to talk here more on the Australian scope, but mainly where you are. And we know that there is as much as climate, political ecology as there is region and community. So what are your ways to nurture this environment, but mainly also, and we had this question in the debate, how can you understand that we don't understand such a basic concept of nurturing the environment? This is sometimes the fact when we are selling our economical model, people has to do it again. So it doesn't work for you, but you are selling to me. So how, maybe Tiriki, how can you explain a different option to nurture the environment?
It's a tough question. Simple answer from our perspective is the use of fire as a farming tool, not something that is a threat. It's learning to live with fire. And that can only happen if you manage the land appropriately in preparing for fire. I heard Yerni talking about storing seeds in ash and in soot and in charcoal. We also did those practices. We didn't collect it and put it in jars, but we stored it in the ash layers of when we burnt country. After we'd done our harvest, we would then burn, not always, not everything, we would burn certain parts of country, and that ash layer actually does store those seeds. And it's where I have to use the scientific methodology for the audience to understand. And botanists botanists are finally starting to catch on to this, that it's not extra fertilizer that you need to bring into country. It's the right use of fire to produce the fertilizer that the land needs. The fertilizer is produced from the senesced plants that as it's burnt, that ash sits in the soil, covering the seeds. When it comes springtime and the temperature of the soil is right and the water moisture is right, the chemicals within the soot are activated, which sends a signal to the seeds to actually grow. It's a circular ecology, and it's understanding the life cycle of fire, not as a destructive force, but as a renewable energy that is a cyclical process. And the more that you use that tool of burning here in Australia, I can't speak for all other countries, although the methodology for fire is relatively the same across all types of ecosystems for Indigenous people, is that as soon as you stop those practices, you are increasing the risk. Now, risk is measured differently from a cultural perspective to a political perspective or an economic perspective. Economically, it's a risk to an asset where someone has invested a lot of money, and if a bushfire runs through, they've lost their business, they have insurance, they've got to rebuild it, but still, it mucks up a lot of people's lives. But from an ecological perspective, the regular application of fire, you never let those fuel loads build up. You have that succession of plants that come through every year. So every year you need to regenerate your seed crop that we use for wheat, for making flour, for all foodstuffs, but you also need to regenerate your seeds for your trees, which are the parents of the grasses. Now, the grasses don't grow. Well, you have grasslands, but they still need the protection of the trees or the shrubs. They are all connected. They call it a fire ladder, but I call it a grandparent, which is the trees, shrubs, which are the parents, and the grasses, which are the children, and the soil is the grandchildren that are not yet born. And we have to look at that type of philosophy of how you have that successive generation. If we were to take the human population and say, right, for a whole generation, we can't have children. What do we have? All we have is an aging population, very hard to get a new population happening, and we senesce. You have to have this continuous cycle going for reproduction of animals. You know, and I consider us animals as humans. It's the same thing when you're working in soils and plants. You have to have that continued succession, not an area where you grow all the trees at one age that are going to produce an amount of product which can be sold out there in the market, which is economically beneficial. But if you don't plan succession plantings and understanding you have to leave that land alone and return it so that you can re-enrich those soils, if you just take more and more land to create your palm oil, eventually all of them, any kind of disaster, a fire, a lightning, a flood or whatever, can take the whole lot out, and economically you're busted. Biodiversity, you're busted, and it takes hundreds of years to come back. It's about using the land for a certain purpose, for a certain amount of time, allowing it to give what it wants to give to you, and knowing when to walk away from it. Not put extra fertilizer, invest more money, raise the prices. There has to be a time when governments and industrialists realise that if you want to do this kind of work, you can use the land. Yes, you can, but you can only use it for a short time. You can't use it and totally exhaust it and then say, oh, I don't want it anymore, give it back to the Indigenous people when we can't actually use it. I hope that answers the question.
This is what's happening everywhere anyway. Exogenous civilization are very good at that. Tiriki, Honus, if you have some idea about this notion of nurturing, you are in educational system, maybe not just based on environment, maybe on different cultural aspects.
Well, it's interesting because I think when we think about terms like extractivism, we think about it first and foremost in a very real and tangible sense, particularly in the sense of going into the ground and taking something out, be it mining, be it an open wholesale rape and pillage of country. Oftentimes, and I think we're becoming a little bit better at this conversation now, oftentimes we don't think about that intergenerational long term, and I think this is a part of what you're speaking to there as well, Uncle David, is just this idea of the long-term impacts of not caring for country, of farming country in a certain way that does not work with place is horrendous, and one could even argue is just as destructive perhaps as mining or
absolutely,
or other or that really aggressive interaction with country. And I think there are a number of problems here, and it does touch a little bit on the previous question that you asked as well, Alban, that I think there's also a big systemic problem with the way that we approach the relationship with country. And even now we can have these conversations, and quite often we can say, oh yes, but it's obvious. And it is obvious, but there is also an inherent connection between a colonial system that seeks to expropriate land from First Peoples and an acknowledgement of the knowledge and the technology that people hold that connects them to place. And as soon as you start acknowledging those histories and that deep-seated knowledge, you also then have to acknowledge the fact that people have that knowledge because that country is theirs. And part of this conversation, I think, often comes down to a lack of a willingness to engage with history, a lack of a willingness to have a meaningful and productive conversation about deep-seated knowledges that have existed in place, because if we do, it challenges the land tenure of the invader. That's right. Yeah, well said. And it takes away all of that authority. So country, soil at its very fabric becomes something which must be shaped and molded and forced into a shape because that's how it works elsewhere. I've grown up here on Wurundjeri country. I've spent time out on the slopes of Coranderrk, Mount Dandenong, and so often I hear people talk about the beauty of the landscape below, that it looks just like an English countryside because everything has been taken away and scraped back and made to look like somewhere that it's not. It's that same culture of trying to recreate something, trying to add weight to a very tenuous argument for someone's land tenure. It doesn't acknowledge the deep-seated and significant stories of place, because to do so shakes the foundations of so much of what we do. Even to have a conversation about the nature of soil is to challenge that colonial project in a very real and meaningful way.
It's about domination over land.
Absolutely.
Which is absolutely in opposites culturally, where the land actually dominates us. We
belong to
what
it.
the land tells us. By
Yeah.
reading country, we know when to walk away, when we need to intervene, to sometimes a greater degree, sometimes to a lesser degree. Going back to what Yoni was talking about, when you're extracting leaves for weaving, that's the same here. We use a plant called the lamandra, and you don't just go and cut the whole plant down. You go and select some leaves at the right time of the year. When we're taking tubers out of the ground, you don't just clear the whole plot. You leave one plant, take three, leave one plant, take three, leave one plant, take three. So you've got those successions that can continue on. If you can't do that, you collect seed, or you collect seed as well, in case you have a season that doesn't work. Everything is very carefully planned within an ecosystem that maintains its biodiversity. You can take 20% of it out, but you need to put 21% or 22% back into it for the next season. Otherwise, 20% plus 20% plus 20% over 5 years is 100%. And in 5 years, you've got nothing left.
Can I just add one point? So, excuse me, Yurani, I am a weaver and I can't wait to meet you in person as the two women here tonight. But I also wanted to say, I think what our ancestors did so beautifully was, we are all here for a short amount of time. While we are here in our physical bodies, we are contributing to this enormous, complex, most masterful, beautiful web, which is going to sustain humans forever. And that's something I think that is really remarkable and beautiful. And in some ways, I'll be honest, sometimes I can say those words, but sometimes I don't really understand it as well, because I'm a human and I live right now and I'm on, the internet right now, and I'm living in this kind of bizarre world compared to my ancestors. But it's that beautiful commitment to the land, to myself and to all of you, that I'm going to do the best that I can to leave this environment in the most beautiful state possible, so that all of my grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren and all of those that are not even thought of yet, that they can thrive. So this beautiful idea of collaboration and cooperation between humans, that's what the Indigenous people have got. That's what we are the experts at. And I don't care what words you use. I'm a teacher and I like to talk to 5-year-olds about this, and gee, they get it. It's just us when we get a bit older and we become, I don't know, kind of disconnected or self-absorbed or whatever happens to us, that we kind of forget that message. And thank goodness, for me in particular, that I've always grown up on my country and had connection to powerful places, that I can be reminded of that at times. And of course I forget it along the way, but I think that's a really important point to make, that our ancestors knew. We're just one human and we are committing to this awesome, big, beautiful sphere of life. Indigenous peoples, where it's at.
Exactly. So Yoni, we may be able to get back to you, but after I'm just going to continue the presentation, and just to make sure that we just follow the same type of idea, all the different segment of question we have here. So Well, there is one way to understand this nature, that we understand there is an investment, and it starts to finally propagate in all the political ecology and economy. We invest in our kids. This is the reason why we are able to pay so much for university. We invest in our housing. It's not a place to be able to sit where the environment was a place where we can do agriculture. No, it's finally a place when we might be able just to invest, maybe to go to another place. So this is one way to do it. And this is what we call the green capitalism. So the problem finally is when we have a crisis for the previous ecological crisis or ontological crisis, the way we live from COVID, we always get back to you, Indigenous, to say, but finally, how do you do? Because you're always there, you have the good solution, but finally, we don't have the ability to, once again, consider the nature differently. What I'm going to once again ask you, it's finally, you, and this is what you just explained, you have what we call an ecology of gratitude. This is what you all try to explain. There is a normal way in terms of ecological design to be part of this back and forth system. And we don't do it on purpose. We just do it because this is for beyond us, from before us. So we are just part of a large ecological system. So, but how can you help us once again to finally try to implement such a system?
Maybe can I start and jump in, Alban? And the reason I want to jump in is that image that you saw is at Coranderrk, and it's a tree planting day, and it's all volunteers. So at Wandoon Estate, we're a very small group of people, and we have this most tremendous group of volunteers who turn up and do, you know, literally all the dirty work. They have been combating thistles and blackberry and doing this amazing work. And I just wanted to share that for me personally, having the support of individuals, some who I know closely and some who I don't, are willing to follow and say, hey, we care enough about this beautiful country called Australia that we are going to get our hands dirty. I just wanted to say that. I want to recognise all the beautiful volunteers that contribute to Coranderrk, because holy swear wordy dooly, we would not get anything done without them. And the second thing I'd like to say, I believe that Bunjil created humans from the land. If I don't love the land, I don't love myself.
Maybe
I would like to say one thing about the volunteers. It's a very good point that Brooke raises. Not only do they come out and volunteer to work at Wandoon Estate, they come out here to be led by Aboriginal people. They may have their own ideas and they put them forward, but if that's not what we want, then we don't implement it. They understand that we are in charge, that this is new territory for them. So we have people that do permaculture, or they work for a friends of group, or they've got some sort of degree. We've got a bloke from CSIRO, we've got a bloke from TarraWarra Institute who comes up, and they know all the academic, the Latin names for everything, but they turn that off and they come to be led by Aboriginal people. And that's an amazing turnaround. Instead of asking us to volunteer on projects with them, they're coming out and volunteering with us and being led by Indigenous people. So they can take that back to their workplace and say, you know what? Not much different in what we do between Aboriginal people and the industrialists or the modern society, because we all have the same goal. We really actually do. We all have the same goal as humans. We do want to leave it in a better place. But Indigenous people want to leave it physically in a better place, whereas the modern world wants to leave it economically in a better place. And you can't do that. You can't separate the ecology from the economy. And unfortunately, that's what we are doing. And the more you use it for economic reasons, you are having an impact on the ecology. And when you impact the ecology, you also affect the culture, because the culture is driven by the ecology. And vice versa. That is that circle. Economy doesn't come into it.
Yoni, Tiriku, if you would like just to maybe to explain. So once again, we always talk about this idea of gratitude, the fact that you back and forth, but we believe exogenous try to do the same, and there is this sustainable development where we try to protect, we try to nurture, but it doesn't work in the same way. How can you explain to us the big difference about your ecological philosophy and ours? Theoretically, if you have some idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tiriki, maybe. Yeah. Tiriki.
Yeah, I can. I was just waiting for you.
Yeah.
Saat ini kami sedang dalam
So now
proses
we're
pengajuan
in the process
pengakuan
of
terhadap
trying to
masyarakat
get
adat dan
the recognition
pengajuan terhadap
for the
pengakuan
indigenous
terhadap hutan adat.
community
Nah, ini
and
merupakan
also the
salah satu
customary
upaya
forest.
kami dalam
This is one
hal
of our
pelestarian
efforts to
hutan kami, lingkungan
protect
kami.
our
Nah,
forest and our environment.
sejauh ini juga kami juga
And
sedang
so far,
identifikasi
we're
terhadap
trying to identify
pengetahuan lokal kami.
the local
Menulis
knowledge
kembali,
that we have. We try
tentang,
to
pengetahuan
rewrite
kami.
the
Misalnya
local
tentang jenis
knowledge.
obat-obatan
For example,
tradisional
about
yang
the
ada.
traditional
Nah,
medicines
memang
that
tidak
we
bisa
have,
dipungkiri bahwa
and we cannot deny the fact
globalisasi
that
juga mempengaruhi,
globalization
teknologi dan
has
globalisasi
affected
juga
us.
mempengaruhi,
Technology and globalization have affected us,
perubahan-perubahan yang
and
terjadi
they
terhadap
triggered the
wilayah
changes
adat
that we
dan
have seen
orang-orangnya
in the
sendiri.
customary
Karena,
land and the people, the
tidak bisa
indigenous
dipungkiri
community.
bahwa banyak
We
juga
can't deny that
masyarakat adat
there
yang
are
sudah mulai
many
terpengaruh
of
dengan
us in the indigenous group that have been
ekonomi kapitalis
affected
itu.
by this
Nah, dengan cara
capitalistic economy
menjual
by
wilayah adatnya,
selling
menjual
their
tanah, itu
customary
tidak
land.
terjadi. Nah, tapi
So
bagaimana
that
kemudian
happened. But
orang-orang yang masih komitmen untuk
how
menjaga wilayah adat
the
ini
committed
tetap
people
kita
who are
rangkul,
trying to
kita
protect
upayakan
the
untuk tetap bisa
customary land, we reach
untuk
out
tetap
to
bisa
them.
menjaga
We
wilayahnya.
try
Nah,
to
mungkin
help
kita
them
memang
to
tidak bisa secara
maintain
nyata
the
langsung
land.
untuk
Perhaps
memaksa
we
orang untuk
can't
menjaga
force people
wilayahnya, bahwa kamu
to
tidak boleh menjual
maintain the
tanahmu,
land. We
kamu
can't
tidak
say that
boleh
you can't
membuka tambang di tanahmu.
you
Mungkin kita
can't
tidak bisa memaksa
sell your
secara
land.
langsung.
We
Tapi
can't say
bagaimana kita
that.
berupaya seperti tadi, kita mengajak
But
dengan
how
cara
we
misalnya kita
reach
melakukan
out to them
pelatihan-pelatihan.
by providing
Kami sudah
training
melakukan
activities.
pelatihan
For
menganyam,
example,
karena memang
we provide
menganyam ini
weaving
di tempat kami hanya
activity,
diketahui oleh
training
orang-orang
for
tua.
weaving, because the
Pengetahuan menganyam
knowledge
ini
and the
hanya dimiliki
skills
oleh
for
orang-orang
weaving
tua, sehingga
is
generasi
maintained
generasi
by
muda
the
itu
elderly. So the
hampir
younger
tidak ada yang
generation,
memiliki pengetahuan tentang menganyam ini.
not
Nah,
a
kami
lot of them
berinisiatif
or
untuk
almost
melakukan
none
pelatihan
have this knowledge
menganyam
and
di
skills for
beberapa tempat.
weaving.
Dan
So we had the initiative
itu
to provide
kemudian
training for
menghasilkan
weaving
generasi
skills.
penerus penganyam.
And now we
Nah,
have
selain itu juga kami melakukan
weavers, the next
dokumentasi
generation
terhadap
of weavers, and we
pengetahuan tentang
also
obat-obatan.
document our
Kami
knowledge
menulisnya,
about
kemudian
medicinal
kami
plants.
bahan-bahannya
We
yang
write
masih mungkin dan
the
masih ada
medicinal
kami
plants and the materials that we
dokumentasikan,
still
kami
have.
foto, kami
We
simpan
document
fotonya.
them.
Nah,
We take the pictures.
sekalipun ke depannya nanti
Although
mungkin
in the
wilayah adat
future,
kami akan berubah,
perhaps
tempat kami akan
we will see changes in our
kami akan
customary
berganti,
land.
tapi paling tidak
Perhaps
pengetahuan-pengetahuan itu
the
masih
people will
tersimpan,
change, but at
tidak
least
hilang sama
this
sekali.
knowledge is
Karena
maintained.
anak-anak
It's
masih
not
bisa melihat
gone, and
berapa
our
jenis tanaman yang
children
tadinya
can
sangat
still
bermanfaat
see
untuk masyarakat.
the
Nah,
different plants that
terkait pengelolaan
were very useful to the
lingkungan juga
community. And about
seperti yang
the
kawan-kawan tadi bilang,
environmental
tempat kami
management,
juga
as you said,
sama menggunakan,
it's similar
kami
with
tidak
us.
menggunakan,
We
nenek
don't
moyang kami tidak
use, so
menggunakan
our
pestisida.
ancestors did not use
Dalam pengolahan
pesticides
tanah kami
in
menggunakan
managing the
bakar,
land.
misalnya seperti
We
yang
used
diceritakan
cultural
kawan tadi,
burn,
bahwa
just as we've heard.
membuka ladang kami
So when we
melakukan
open the
pembakaran,
land,
dan itu dengan
we
cara dan syarat-syarat
we did
tertentu.
cultural burns,
Tapi
and we
sayangnya
used
ada aturan dari pemerintah kami untuk saat ini bahwa ada
certain
larangan
traditions,
membakar
but the government
ladang,
has
karena
banned
menurut mereka
the
itu
burn
menghasilkan
because they think, the government thinks that
menghasilkan
this
kerusakan udara,
will result
padahal
in
yang
the
melakukan
air
pembakaran
pollution,
besar-besaran
but
itu justru
the
korporasi,
large-scale
justru
burning
perkebunan
is done
kelapa
by
sawit itu.
corporations, by the
Kalau
palm
kami yang
oil
masyarakat adat kan
plantations,
hanya
not
membakar,
us,
kami
not
menggunakan
the
waktu tertentu,
community,
kami hanya membakar
indigenous
hanya
community,
dalam
because we
skala
only
kecil,
burn in
dan
small
kami
scale,
juga
in small
tidak
plots,
membakar
only in certain time, and
sembarang bakar. Kami
we just
menggunakan
don't burn.
ritual,
We
kami
do
mempersiapkan
rituals,
alat-alat
we
sekat
prepare
seperti sekat
the the dikes, the requirements, the bamboo sprays to make sure that the fire is isolated and not spread to the forest or to other places. So we prepare the cultural burn very well. We just don't just burn. And but the government argues that the fog or the forest fire is started by us, the indigenous groups. So this created conflicts between us and the government. And what is sad here is that we, the farmers, we are forced to do the cultural burn at night because we don't want the government to catch us and to imprison us. So the land cannot be burned well. So this is what is happening in our place now. And also, traditional agriculture has often been replaced by palm oil plantations and modern agriculture. So as we switch to modern agriculture, then we have to buy seeds from outside, we have to use pesticides. So this is a challenge, a significant challenge for us now, and we're now resisting, we're struggling in our resistance to this, although it's not physical resistance. Thank you.
Yeah, passive resistance by demonstration.
Yeah,
and unfortunately, the government wants to get you to, just like you spoke about the rats and how you deal with rats that are in your crops, the government wants you to be a rat and get on the wheel of economic prosperity. But to do that, you have to give up your cultural obligations. And this is what the government does, is understand that, you know, we are protesting. Scientists are actually joining us in saying that we cannot keep going down this path of everything must have an economical value. It is about going back and looking at the social values. It's going back and look at the ecological values, and it's going back to look at the long-term environmental values. Science, just like back in the 70s when they told us climate change was coming and the governments wouldn't listen because there wasn't enough people saying it. Science is getting together. We can see there's partners that are on this project now. Many of us do work as consultants to universities, and there are many of the younger people who say, we don't want to go down the path that our professors did. We want to be innovative and reinvigorate something that did work, because they can see we are on a slow decline to destruction. They want to reverse that. So science will play an important part in the reinvigoration of cultural practice.
Thank you, everybody. So we mainly close this session of finally, how can we hear from you and the little debate. So we just continue for the next 20 minutes. So as I said, we are going to talk about the same thing. So if you didn't speak up your mind entirely, this is the right time. We already have questions from the audience. So mainly because, of course, they were listening to you for years. They are going to ask you mostly what you've been said, but maybe not precisely enough. So the first question from the audience, it's someone is asking why the British occupier, but maybe all imperialist country did not learn to eat this bush food. I think we've been explaining a little bit, but maybe Tiriki, maybe you can explain to us, or larger for, it's more about the food, why they do not take something that finally they don't produce themselves and don't benefit from their own economy?
Because there's a tremendous amount of ego tied up in it as well, I think is one of the easiest answers. That when you look at how colonization, invasion works throughout the world, it is based upon a hierarchy that privileges a certain knowledge over another. a social Darwinist construct that is so egotistical. It says, well, I must be more evolved than these people because I've invented war and colonization and germ warfare and all of these other things. Whereas many of us First Peoples, I think, can turn around and think that we're more civilized for exactly the same reasons, just the other way around. But so much of the system has been created to obliterate and ignore First Peoples knowledge, even when it's been being said loudly, shouted in the face of the system. You know, I can go back to my Yorta country. I was standing there recently with my uncle Colin Walker, who would talk about the way his grandfather could put his hand in the river, in the Tangala, our river, and by feeling the temperature of the water on his hand, he knew if the fish was spawning upriver. That with one sweep of Uncle Colin's hand, he takes in the forest and he says, this was our university. And he's absolutely right. But the stories and the lack of First Nations authority in the conversations, and I think this comes back a bit as well to some of the points that you were making, Uncle Dave, about people working at the direction and under the authority of Aboriginal people who have the knowledge of country and place. We're still in very early days sometimes with that conversation. I think it's very hard for others to change that dynamic and re-engage. And it's not about us. It's not that we're necessarily bad people. It's not that we are bad people, but I think a big part of this conversation is understanding the frameworks and the legacies of a system of invasion and colonization that has existed for many, many generations in this space, and what we unknowingly and unwittingly accept as truth. That there is one way to do things, it is the right way, and there is one which is lesser than, or even less evolved. And this is the type of language that has been used. I think there's a lot of work to do in deconstructing those conversations and talking about the real root of our knowledge systems, our understandings, and then talking about how we build them. Because I certainly don't think it's for lack of Indigenous people around the world trying to tell others how to look after country and how to look after place. And it's also not just not a listening. It's also not just a cultural psychosis and a deafness that people have in this space. There's a lot more at the root of this conversation, I think, and unpacking that and understanding that all of us can be allies, all of us, black, white, brindle, wherever we come from in this space. But we always have to ask ourselves what real meaningful authority is and who is holding the authority in that conversation. And it can be very hard to give up authority when you've gotten very used to it.
Governments do not like to give up authority. Absolutely. That's why they write so many rules, hoping that we legally don't understand them, so they can baffle you with their BS. To say, well, okay, yeah, you're using this legislation, but this other legislation cancels that out.
Yes.
And also, when it comes to the question about, why didn't the early colonists, recognise our foods? In actual fact, they did, but they only recognised them as a resource to be extracted from us. What they didn't learn was how to cook them. Now, in the movie, that short thing that we put down, that quite a lot of our foods are poisonous if not treated properly. And they decided that those foods were no good because they were getting sick from eating them. And so therefore they weren't a food. And also, any war is usually a war of attrition. Now, and if both sides got guns, they use guns, but it always comes down to supply. And if you can remove food and water, access to that is how you win a war. So people say, but there were no blackfellow wars here in Australia. There was no declared war, and yet there were wars, and there was still a war going on by not recognising our sovereign rights to our traditional foods on our traditional lands. So that is a silent war that the government is doing, and we're silently protesting back and saying, well, as we claw back pieces of land, and as we talk to private property owners, they are saying, they're asking us now, can we grow your food on our land? We would like to help grow this food for you. We want to learn how to utilise this. And eventually, the government will have to recognise the majority and change the way that they look at Indigenous food.
Yeah.
As I said, there's a lot of, yeah, go Brooke. After we are going to move.
So, Tiriki, you just reminded me of something. So I'm a teacher and I spend a couple of days a week with primary school kids. And today I was reading from Young Dark Emu, and regardless of the background philosophy that's happening in the background about that beautiful individual, what's really important about that book is the conversation that has arisen, which is using the records of the colonial people and what they actually witnessed. There's huge amounts of information that was recorded about our ancestors. And in particular, Urani, for me and Dave, there's so much recorded about our ancestors just because of the location of our people. And I'd like to remind everybody that poor old Charles Sturt, starving in the desert, probably on death's door, wandered across a group of black fellas, probably 300 strong, and they were kind to him. They gave him food. They gave him duck. They gave him water. They watered the horses, for example. For me, just for this 2022, in a research kind of mindset, we need blackfellas to have access to this information, to colonise this information, to regain this information, because it shows children that are 10 years old that Aboriginal people were kind to the colonists who tried to destroy us. Now, us as adults, I think we haven't had space to explore those kinds of discussions and narratives and emotions. Bless the hearts of the children at Hillsville Primary School who are 8. They say, oh, Brooke, you told us about that yesterday. Can we go outside and play? But I think as adults, we need a little bit more time to discuss this. A lot was written about us, about all of our ancestors, through the gaze of the white fella.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to twist and turn and re-examine that, and to put it back into our black fella lens and our black fella heart. Because you know what? Our ancestors were so beautiful and kind, and they didn't even need to help Charles Sturt. But of course they did, and they fed him and kept him well. I'll rest my case.
Well, I'm just continuing. We know you're all tired. So we have another question. Wait. Wait, I was just lost a little bit. It's a little bit tricky question. Even me, I'm not sure I understand, but I'm an idiot. You're not. So can you talk a little bit more about the importance of self-determination in addressing the challenge each of your communities are facing? It's about self-determination. Can you talk about it? So Yoni, whoever wants to talk about.
Self-determination is a word created by government saying, why aren't you blackfellas getting off your ass and running your own businesses? And the fact is, we want to. And this is what we're doing here at Coranderrk or Wandoon Estate. We are establishing a business, but not to make money. We are establishing a business that creates a culturally safe space for Aboriginal people to work in. That's what self-determination is. So the business is starting off, we have our cattle here, but it's going to include growing bush foods. And I should talk about when our very, very early one, one of the achievements we've done here at Wandoon Estate, we've realised that we have to diversify, just as we diversified the use of the land, but because we're restricted to a piece of land, how can we get the best biodiversity out of it without overusing it? So you need infrastructure. We are setting up, so we're growing the bush foods. Do we have a market to sell those bush foods? Yes, we do. But can we value add to just selling a product? Who's going to grow them? Can we create employment? So I decided, a group of us decided, we need a nursery so that we can propagate those seeds. We need to clear an area, which means we've got to fence off an area, and it's only clearing weeds and pasture grass, where we can grow them. Then we need a place where we can harvest them and process them. Then look at how can we value add. Can we actually process them to a point where we can sell them as food, not for someone to take away, but can we actually build a restaurant where people can come and eat our foods? Can we teach them to go out and collect these foods, to learn to identify them in the wild, if you like, out in our parks and reserves? But what that actually creates, and again, it's not about making money, it creates the opportunities for Aboriginal people to be trained in horticulture, in agriculture, in whatever the word is for nurseries, kitchen hand, chef, tour guides, farm management, whether that be fencing, cattle, pigs, pork, chicken, whatever it might be, conservation values. So working along our river frontage, which, you know, we've set back our cattle so that it's there for our native animals. There is a range of training opportunities that we can put up, because Aboriginal people don't go out and look for self-determination because they've got to apply for funding to get it. We're actually going to be selling our bush foods to invest in training programs where people can come and learn culturally safe practices and take that out into the wider world, which is something I've already done with general land management anyway, that I started in 2012. I said, bugger this going for money from the government. Let's go out and get contracts to supply a service. And through that is how we will build self-determination. It's one of the ways how we will build self-determination.
Well, I'm just going to be very sorry. There is a time for everything. We start to be a little bit longer. We had a last question, but I think Ungelte was responding. It was about the urgency. And I do believe what everybody tried to say finally, it's not to let you do what you do, but to make sure that you do it in your own term. Because you do it, you do your economy, and there is not the idea that to let you to be able to do it. It's funny to have your own ecology, your own economy, your own space, and not to have to explain to us again. It's already done. And as we heard what is from Tiriki, people are listening, it doesn't work. So finally, there is some place that you have to do it on your own. So I'm going to thank you, everybody. Yoni, sorry, but because it's easier for English speaker, maybe you were not part of the conversation, but it's what it is. I'm very sorry. Thank you, all of you. I think we're going to have a last word from the organizer of this fantastic webinar. As I said, this is going to be recorded. So if there is some questions that you still need to question, those people are still alive. So you might be able to meet them in your own place and to connect them. So Victoria, on you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. A very big thank you to all of our presenters today. We all learned so much, and looking at the chat and the reactions, people are very inspired by all of your stories, and lots of people want to volunteer and help. So we'll put all of that information in the links on the website. And we learned so much today, not just about the different ways in which we can approach the idea of soil, but also the idea of education, how Indigenous people speak about their land, their care for country, the cycles through which nature and bush food go, the importance of leaving the land alone, and the notion too that this is your ecology, this is your story, and at the end of the day, you just have to do what you do, because unfortunately it's your resistance, it's your struggle for sovereignty, and unfortunately not enough people are listening. But I hope that on the eve of Reconciliation Week in Australia here, that more and more people will come to know the important work that's happening at Coranderrk and indeed in Indonesia. Next week on Wednesday again, at the same time as this seminar today, Struggles for Sovereignty in Indonesia will be doing the presentation. Go online to see who's speaking. It, I think, will build very insightfully on what we heard today. And then the week after, the Abbemuseum are taking us out to the farmlands around Eindhoven, and we're meeting some very interesting farmers and land managers there, and also listening to experts in both science and ecology from the Netherlands. It's called Groundwork, these 3 webinars, and they are very much the groundwork for a bigger project that the 3 organisations are working on. The next step is an industry workshop, which we're doing in October in Hillsville. And then in the second half of next year, a big exhibition at TarraWarra, and in 2024, an exhibition at Van Abbey. So thank you for joining us on this journey. Let other people know to join us next week at the same time. And I'll finish with Brooke's incredible sentence. If I don't love the land, I don't love myself. Thank you.